A quiet night, my dear. The moon hangs low and full, a soft lantern spilling silver across your pillow. Outside, the world has already put away its hurry. No clatter of wheels, no urgent voices, just the hush of wind moving through the leaves and the steady, peaceful sound of your own breathing. The stars are scattered like spilled sugar across the deep blue tablecloth of the sky. Everything is safe now. Everything is still. Let your body sink into the mattress. Let the blanket be a gentle weight that tells you, you are held. You are loved. You can rest. Tonight we are going to travel together, not with trains or wings, but with words. We are going to visit a time that still lives inside every schoolbook and every heartbeat that has ever longed to be free. Close your eyes, my darling. Breathe in slowly, and out, even more slowly. Let the room around you soften. Feel your toes, warm and snug. Feel your fingers, loose and relaxed. Now, in your imagination, feel the floor beneath us turn to grass, the ceiling draw back into a wide, star-washed sky. We are stepping backwards, stepping softly, into the middle of the 19th century. The year is somewhere around 1850. We are in the United States of America, a country still very young, still trying to understand what it means. The land is beautiful, rolling green hills in the north, misty blue mountains in the south, great rivers that catch the light like crumpled ribbons, forests full of deer and whippoorwills. In small towns, the air smells of wood smoke and fresh-baked cornbread. Horses' hooves crunch on gravel roads. Men in tall hats tip their brims to women in long cotton dresses. Children chase hoops with sticks down dusty lanes. Church bells mark the hours, and at night, before gas lamps are lit in the cities, you can see thousands of stars, so close they look like you could reach up and brush them with your fingertips. In the countryside, the nights are so dark that the Milky Way appears as a bright, ghostly river, and people navigate by its glow. But underneath all this loveliness there is a deep, aching wrong. It hides in plain sight. In the countryside of the South, beyond the pretty porches and magnolia trees, lie large farms called plantations. And on these plantations work people who are not allowed to leave. They are called slaves. They are owned, like a chair or a wagon or a pair of shoes. They do not choose their work. They do not choose their homes. They do not even choose their own names. And worst of all, my dear, they do not own their own bodies. A mother can be sold away from her baby. A father can vanish down a long red road and never return. A child can grow up never knowing the shape of tomorrow. Because tomorrow always belongs to someone else. Let's step softly now into a cotton field in Mississippi, where the summer heat presses down like a heavy hand. The rows of cotton stretch to the horizon, dotted with figures bent under the sun. The air is thick and still, full of the sharp, green scent of crushed leaves and the dust kicked up by dragging sacks. Dragonflies hover over the ditches. Somewhere, a mockingbird sings a liquid, repeating song. Do I want to introduce you to one of those figures? Her name is Lucy. She is 7 years old, small and wiry, with deep brown eyes that still carry a fleck of light, even though she has already seen too much. Her skin is the color of polished walnut, and her hair is braided tightly against her scalp. She wears a dress made of rough, faded calico that comes down to her shins, and her feet are bare, calloused, and caked with reddish dirt. Lucy lives on a cotton plantation owned by a man she never sees, a name that drops from the overseer's mouth like a threat. Her world is the quarter, the cluster of unpainted cabins set back from the big house, and the endless, undulating sea of cotton. Every morning before the sun peeps above the flat horizon, a great iron bell clangs. The sound rips through the thin walls of the cabin Lucy shares with her mother and 7 other people. She jolts awake on her pallet of corn shucks, tasting dust and tiredness. Her mother, Lena, is already up, tying a kerchief around her head. They don't speak. There is no time. Lucy stumbles out into the grey dawn, the ground cold under her soles for just a few minutes before the sun begins its brutal climb. She collects her canvas sack, longer than she is tall, and takes her row. Her job is to pull the white bowls from their scratchy hulls. The holes bite her fingers. Her back aches from constant stooping. The sun turns the sky into a white-hot bowl. Sweat stings her eyes. But she cannot stop, because an overseer on a horse, a man with a red face and a curled whip, sits in the shade of a solitary oak tree, watching. He times the pickers, shouts at the slow, and the whip is not a decoration. Lucy's hands learn to move mechanically, even as her mind drifts. She watches a ladybug crawl along a stem and wonders where it goes when it flies away. She thinks about the taste of the hoe cake her mother will make later, if they have enough cornmeal. She thinks about the song her mother hums at night. That song is Lucy's true food. When darkness comes, Lucy and Lena retreat to their cabin, a single room with a dirt floor, a stone fireplace, and wooden bunks. The smell of sweat, fatback, and lamp oil clings to everything. The door is a rough slab of wood with gaps wide enough to see the moonlight. Lena sets a small fire, and by its flickering light, she spoons a bit of corn mush into Lucy's wooden bowl. They eat in silence, listening to the crickets start their nightly chorus. Then, before sleep, comes the ritual. Lena pulls Lucy close, so close that Lucy can feel her mother's heartbeat, steady and warm. Lena's hands, cracked and worn smooth as river stones, stroke Lucy's hair. She begins to hum. It's a melody without words, low and mournful, that rises and falls like the wind over the cotton rows. Sometimes it sounds like a question. Sometimes it sounds like an answer. Lucy doesn't know where the song came from. She only knows that it belongs only to them, that it carries something the overseer can never touch. And after the song, as the fire dies to embers, Lena always whispers the same thing, her lips almost brushing Lucy's ear. Freedom is a gift, my little bird. One day the ones who carry it inside the wind will bring it back. Lucy presses those words into her chest like a shiny pebble she has found in the dirt. She does not fully understand. Freedom seems as far away as the moon. But she knows the words are true in the way that water is true, in the way that a mother's love is true. Now, my darling, let's lift on the night breeze. Imagine we are a pair of owls, silent and soft-winged, leaving the cotton fields behind. We fly north, over dark forests and silver-threaded rivers, over small towns where lamps wink out one by one. We are heading to a place called Springfield, Illinois. It's a growing town with clapboard houses, a wooden courthouse where a wooden clock ticks loudly, and streets that turn to thick mud when it rains. Here, in a plain 2-story frame house on 8th Street, a very tall man sits alone by a candle. His name is Abraham Lincoln. His legs are so long they tangle under the little writing desk, and sometimes he reads lying on the floor with his feet up on a chair. His face is lined, not with age yet, but with thought. He has huge, rough-knuckled hands, hands that have split fence rails, gripped an axe handle, and gently turned the pages of 1,000 books. He is a self-taught man. As a boy, he walked miles to borrow a single volume, and read it by the light of the fireplace. Now he is a lawyer, a husband, a father to 3 rambunctious boys who fill the house with noise and scattered toys. But tonight the house is still. Mary, his wife, is asleep upstairs. The boys are bundled in their beds. And Lincoln cannot sleep. He is thinking about something he saw many years before, when he was a young man, barely 19. He took a job on a flatboat that carried goods down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. The river was wide and brown, full of drifting logs and hidden sandbars. He poled the boat during the day and slept under the stars at night, listening to the lapping water and the distant call of whippoorwills. When they finally tied up at the New Orleans waterfront, the city was a riot of smells: fish, spices, coffee, tar, and sweetness from the sugar canes. He wandered the cobblestone streets, wide-eyed. One morning, he walked past a large, open-air market. But it wasn't food being sold. It was human beings. An auction block stood in the center. Men and women, young and old, stood or slumped, their hands and feet in iron chains. Their faces were drained of hope. A man with a loud voice, a slave trader, was calling out prices, pointing at teeth, describing musculature like a farmer pricing livestock. The crowd was noisy, laughing, arguing over bids. Then Lincoln saw a woman and her daughter. The girl was about Luce's age, maybe a little older. She had big, frightened eyes and clutched her mother's hand. The mother stood straight, but her gaze was far away, as if she had left her body behind to endure what was happening. The auctioneer separated them. He pushed the mother to one side and the girl to the other. A man bid on the mother, another on the girl. The girl started to cry. The mother's face twisted in a silent scream. Lincoln's heart, that strong, steady muscle, clenched like a fist. He had seen poverty and hard work and death, but he had never seen a person bought and sold as if she had no soul. He could do nothing then. He was a stranger, a boy. But he walked away that day, and the look the girl gave him, a look of pure, wordless pleading, settled in his chest like a stone. He never forgot it. And now, decades later, sitting by a candle in Springfield, that stone is still there. He whispers to himself, as he often does, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Remember that sentence, my dear. It is a compass. In the years to come, when the whole country seemed to be breaking apart, that compass would hold steady in Lincoln's heart. Now, let's widen our view. America in the 1850s is not one country. It's 2 invisible nations staring at each other across an ever-deepening chasm. In the north, towns are growing into cities, factories hum, canals and railroads stitch the land together, and a new political party, the Republicans, forms with one central idea: stop the spread of slavery into new Western territories. Not abolish it, not yet, but draw a line. Many Northerners are not saints. Some dislike slavery but fear what will happen if millions of freed people live among them. Others, called abolitionists, demand immediate, uncompensated emancipation. They publish newspapers like The Liberator, edited by a fiery man named William Lloyd Garrison, whose words called like a brand, "I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." They hold meetings in halls and churches, passing resolutions, sheltering fugitives. Some, like the Quakers, have opposed slavery for generations, quietly, persistently, as steady as the tide in the South. The economy is built on cotton, and cotton is built on chattel slavery. The cotton gin, invented decades earlier, has made short-staple cotton wildly profitable. Plantation owners live in pillared mansions, send their sons to fine universities, and dominate politics. They argue fiercely that slavery is a positive good, that black people are inferior and happier under white guardianship. Books are written, sermons preached, laws passed, all to tighten the chains and silence any opposition. In the South, it becomes dangerous to even speak against slavery. Mail is censored. Abolitionist literature is burned. Free black people live under constant suspicion, their rights stripped away state by state. In the middle, the slaveholding border states like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and later West Virginia, strain between the two. Families split, churches divide, newspapers wage war with ink and paper. The national government stumbles from one compromise to the next, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, each more fragile than the last. A brutal guerrilla war erupts in bleeding Kansas, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers pour in and kill each other over whether the territory will enter the Union slave or free. The Supreme Court rules in the Dred Scott case that black people, whether enslaved or free, are not citizens and have no rights that white men are bound to respect. It is a decision that seems to slam the final door on hope. But instead, it pours fuel on a growing fire. Through all this, the Underground Railroad keeps running. In the darkness, a secret river of compassion flows north. It is not a railroad at all, but a loose web of brave souls, black and white, free and fugitive, who ferry escaping slaves from one station to the next, hiding them in barns, attics, church basements, and wagons with false bottoms. The conductors are former slaves themselves, like the legendary Harriet Tubman, a tiny, indomitable woman who carries a pistol and suffers from visions she believes are sent by God, leading her back again and again into the slave states to guide out her people. Or like Frederick Douglass, the brilliant orator with a lion's manner of hair, who escaped slavery with a sailor's uniform and forged documents, and now stands before spellbound audiences, his voice a thunderclap of righteous fury. Without a struggle, there can be no progress. And that brings us to our first little story inside the big story, a story of a boy who was not a conductor, not a famous orator, but whose hands did holy work. Let me tell you about Eli, the tailor's apprentice in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Just across the river from the slave state of Kentucky, there was a narrow, winding street called German Lane. It smelled of dye, wet wool, lye soap, and the yeasty aroma from a nearby brewery. The street echoed with the clop of horses and the musical cadence of German and Irish voices. In the middle of the block sat Fisher's tailor shop, a small establishment with a creaking sign shaped like a pair of scissors. The front window displayed a few rolls of cloth and a dusty velvet waistcoat. Inside, it was all order, bolts of wool, cotton, and linen stacked by color, spools of thread in cubbies, shears and measuring tapes hanging on pegs. The floor was swept clean, the counter polished with beeswax. A coal stove glowed in the corner in winter, and the air was always warm with the hiss of steam from a pressing iron. Eli was 12 years old, an orphan from a distant cousin's family who could no longer keep him. He was thin as a sapling, with pale skin, ink-stained fingers, and a shock of brown hair that fell perpetually into his eyes. A dusting of freckles crossed his nose. He had been apprenticed to Mr. Fisher for a year, and in that time, he had learned to hem trousers, sew on buttons that would not pop off, and baste coat linings with stitches so even they looked like tiny railroad tracks. Mr. Fisher, the master tailor, was a man of few words. He was old, with white hair cropped close to his skull, spectacles perched on his nose, and a pronounced stoop from decades of bending over his work. His hands were gnarled but incredibly precise. He had come from Germany many years ago, fleeing some sorrow that he never named. He spoke with a soft, rumbling accent and communicated mostly through nods, raised eyebrows, and occasional grunts that Eli learned to interpret as good or rip it out and do it again. One night, long after the shop had closed, Eli was up late in his small attic room above the shop. He couldn't sleep. A mouse was scrabbling in the wall. He decided to go down to the workroom to practice his buttonholes by the glow of the banked coals. As he crept down the steep wooden stairway, barefoot to muffle his steps, he noticed a crack of light under the workroom door. That was odd. Mr. Fisher was usually in bed by 9, and they were both miserly with lamp oil. Eli peeked through the crack. Mr. Fisher was standing at the back door, which opened onto the alley. He had set a small parcel on the windowsill, several thick slices of dark bread, a wedge of cheese wrapped in a cloth, and a pair of stout walking shoes that Eli had seen in the shop for weeks, never claimed. The old tailor opened the door a crack and gave a low, 3-note whistle, soft as a bird call, but not quite. It sounded like the call of a white-throated sparrow, but the rhythm was off. A long pause. Then, from the inky shadows of the alley, a shape detached itself and crept forward. A man, barefoot and trembling, his clothes torn and muddy. He was a black man, his face gaunt, his eyes darting with a mixture of terror and hope. He took the bundle without a word, touched his forehead in a silent gesture of thanks, and melted back into the dark. Mr. Fisher shut the door, bolted it, and stood for a moment with his head bowed. Then he turned, and his eyes met Eli's at the crack in the door. Eli froze. His heart hammered. But Mr. Fisher only put a finger to his lips and beckoned. Trembling, Eli pushed the door open. The old tailor led him without a word down a rickety set of stairs to the cellar, a damp, earthen-floored room where they stored potatoes and turnips. Behind a stack of empty crates and a heavy bolt of wax canvas, there was a small hidden door, no bigger than a cupboard. Mr. Fisher unlatched it. Inside was a tiny space, scarcely 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, with a straw mattress, a rough wool blanket, and a clay jug of water. "For travelers," Mr. Fisher said, his voice a low rumble. "Some birds fly north in the dark." Eli understood at once. The travelers were people escaping from slavery. the Underground Railroad ran. Right through this humble tailor shop on German Lane. There were no rails, no whistles, no timetables. Only an old man with a limp and a secret room behind the potatoes. Eli's world tilted on its axis. He had known, in an abstract way, that slavery existed across the river. He had heard it talked about by customers, sometimes in hushed, angry tones. But here, in the middle of the night, it had a face, a tired, hungry, desperate face. And Mr. Fisher, this quiet, stern man who said 10 words a day and scolded Eli for crooked stitches, was a conductor on that hidden railroad. Eli's admiration for him bloomed like a flower in fast motion, and he felt a sudden, overwhelming need to help. "Can I do something?" Eli whispered, his voice cracking. Mr. Fisher looked at him for a long moment, his pale old eyes unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "You sew," he said. "You sew neat and small. You can sew something that speaks." From that night on, Eli became part of the secret. He could not be a conductor. He was too young, too skinny, liable to get lost in the woods himself. But he found his own way. Inside the lining of the coats Mr. Fisher sold or gave away to the fugitives, Eli began to stitch tiny maps. He used different colored threads, blue for rivers, green for safe forests, a small red cross for a house that would give shelter. He learned the local routes from whispered conversations. A safe farm run by a Quaker family outside town. A mill where the miller would hide people in the grain bins. A church where the pastor, a stern-looking man with a bald head and fiery eyes, would open the crypt. These became red crosses. A creek that led to a deeper river, which in turn led to Lake Erie and ultimately to Canada, where slavery was illegal. That was a blue line. Eli worked by the light of a single candle, cross-legged on the floor, his tongue poking out between his teeth in concentration. Every stitch was a tiny prayer. "Go safely," he would whisper to the coat. "Walk north. Keep going. You are almost free." The stitches were so hidden that only the wearer knew to look. The maps were simple, a few lines, a few symbols, but in the terror of flight, they were a lifeline. One coat in particular was given to a strong-shouldered woman named Hester. Hester had run away from a tobacco farm in Kentucky after her husband was sold south to Louisiana, a place spoken of in whispers as a living graveyard. She had been a cook, and her hands knew how to fold dough and chop vegetables, but now they held nothing but a desperate resolve. She traveled by night, navigating by the drinking gourd, what we call the Big Dipper, as countless escapees did, following the pointer stars to the North Star, a fixed point of light that did not waver. She dodged patrols, waded through swamps, and once lay motionless in a ditch for an hour while men with lanterns and dogs passed by on the road above. When Hester reached Cincinnati, she was half-starved and her shoes had disintegrated. A dock worker, a free black man who worked the riverboats, found her hiding under a pier and directed her to Fisher's shop, saying only "the tailor" at the crooked sign. She arrived in the deepest part of night, her knock a prearranged pattern. Mr. Fisher let her in, gave her soup, and fitted her with the coat, a sturdy, brown wool garment with a deep hood. He also gave her the shoes, a small knife, and a packet of dried meat. Before she left the cellar the next evening, he showed her the lining. "If you feel lost," he said, "feel here." He pressed her fingers to the fabric. Hester set out again. The night was moonless, and the forest was a tangle of shadows and strange sounds. The sudden scream of a fox, the rustle of something large in the underbrush. Her heart pounded, but she kept moving. At a fork in the path, she paused, uncertain. She remembered the coat. With trembling fingers, she traced the inside. There they were, Eli's tiny stitches. A blue line meant a stream to follow. A red cross meant the Quaker farm. She felt the direction, whispered a blessing on the unknown hand that had sewn it, and turned left. That farm, run by a family named Hargrove, was a place of profound peace. The Hargroves were plain-dressed people who said thee and thou, and believed that every human being carried the inner light of God. They gave Hester a clean dress, a hot bath, and 3 days of rest in a hayloft that smelled sweetly of timothy grass. Their children, barefoot and solemn, brought her plates of food and asked no questions. When Hester finally crossed into Canada near the city of Detroit, and felt the cold, free air on her face, she was wearing Eli's coat. She kept it for years, and when the war came, she would show it to her children and say, "A child stitched hope into this cloth. You are free because strangers refuse to look away." This is how freedom moves, my darling. Often hidden, often quiet, but unstoppable as the sap rising in spring. Eli's fingers, a needle, and some colored thread became part of a great, invisible current that was carrying thousands of souls northward. Now, not everyone could run. Most enslaved people were trapped deep in the interior, far from free states, with few resources and many loved ones they could not bear to leave. And for those who did run, the psychological cost was immense. They left behind mothers, fathers, children, the only homes they knew, however brutal. The decision to flee was a tearing of the very fabric of life. Many who escaped were haunted by the faces of those left behind. But they also carried a fierce hope, and they whispered it to one another in the slave quarters: "Moses is coming." Moses was a code name for Harriet Tubman, who would travel by night and lead groups like a shepherd, never losing a single passenger. When she sang "Go Down, Moses," the old spiritual, her voice was quiet but her meaning was clear. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Let's breathe here a moment, my love. Settle deeper into your pillow. The night is still and soft around us. Can you hear the echo of that spiritual? It's a song born in bondage but filled with an irresistible hope. That hope is what we are following now. The nation hurtled toward disaster. In 1858, Abraham Lincoln, by then a well-known lawyer and politician, challenged the incumbent Senator Stephen Douglas in a series of famous debates across Illinois. The two men couldn't have looked more different. Lincoln tall and angular, with a high, reedy voice. Douglas short and barrel-chested, a booming orator dressed in the finest suits. They debated in town squares, under the hot sun, with thousands of spectators picnicking and shouting. The central issue: slavery. Lincoln, speaking with a deliberate, measured clarity, stated that a house divided against itself cannot stand. He did not yet call for full racial equality. The times would not have borne it, but he declared that slavery was a moral wrong that must be placed in the course of ultimate extinction. Douglas, arguing for popular sovereignty, said each territory should decide for itself, and he painted Lincoln as a dangerous radical who would unleash a flood of black migration and race mixing. Lincoln lost that Senate election, but his words were printed in newspapers across the land. The tall man with the sad eyes became a national figure, a voice of conscience in a republic that was losing its moral bearings. 2 years later, in 1860, Lincoln won the presidency in a fractious, four-way race, carrying almost no southern states. His name wasn't even on the ballot in most of the South. The election was the spark. Before he was even inaugurated, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 6 more states quickly followed, forming the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as its president. They wrote their own constitution, which explicitly protected slavery. Lincoln traveled to Washington in secret, bypassing a rumored assassination plot in Baltimore, enduring ridicule in the press for sneaking into the Capitol like a thief. But he arrived safely, and on a raw, windy March day in 1861, he stood on the east portico of the Capitol and took the oath of office. His inaugural address was a plea: "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." He begged the South to come back. He promised he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. But he also said, firmly, the union of these states is perpetual. The plea fell on deaf ears. In April, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal garrison in Charleston Harbor. The shelling lasted 34 hours. The fort surrendered. The news electrified the North. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Suddenly, the nation was at war. Let me pause here, my darling, and remind you that this story is not just about presidents and battles. It is about people, millions of people, caught in the grinding machinery of history. So let me tell you our second little story inside the big story. The story of a widow named Grace, whose lamp never went out. Grace lived on a small, hardscrabble farm in southern Indiana, just across the river from the slave state of Kentucky. Her farm sat at the edge of a vast forest of oak and hickory, and on still nights, she could hear the river shushing by like a whispered secret. The farmhouse was a simple wooden structure with a sloping roof, a stone chimney, and a porch that sagged a little. Grace was not yet 40, but she looked older. She had a strong, angular face, sun-worn skin, and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her hands were rough and capable. She had been widowed for 6 years. Her husband Elias taken by cholera in an outbreak that swept through the county. Their only child, a bright-eyed girl named Ruth, had died of the same disease 3 days later. Grace had buried them both under an oak tree on the hill behind the house, and then she had gone back inside and sat in her rocking chair for a very long time, the silence pressing on her like a physical weight. But grief, in Grace, did not curdle into bitterness. It hollowed her out, but it also made her a vessel. She began to notice things she might have missed in the busyness of family life. She noticed the way the morning light touched the floorboards. She noticed the songs of the thrushes. And she noticed the travelers. Southern Indiana was a corridor on the Underground Railroad. Fugitives from Kentucky would cross the river and fan out, looking for guidance. Some came to Grace's door because they had heard from a previous station that she could be trusted. The first time it happened, a knock came at midnight. Grace opened the door with a lantern held high and saw a man, a woman, and a child, a little girl with wide, terrified eyes. They were soaked, having swum the river, and the woman's feet were bleeding. Without a word, Grace opened the door wide. She fed them cold cornbread and buttermilk. She hid them in the root cellar beneath her kitchen, a cramped space that smelled of damp earth and apples. Before dawn, she led them through the woods to a Quaker settlement 5 miles north. When she returned home, she felt something she hadn't felt since Ruth died, a flicker of purpose. After that, Grace lit a lantern in her window every single night, rain or shine, winter or summer. It was a sign. The burning wick consumed precious oil that she could ill afford, but she considered it tithe. Neighbors talked. Some disapproved, saying she was asking to have her house burned down by slave catchers. But most left her alone, out of respect for her losses, or perhaps because something in her stern, sorrow-charged gaze warned them off. One frozen night in January, a woman came alone. She was young, her name was Margaret, and she was carrying a baby boy tied to her chest with strips of cloth. Margaret had fled a plantation in Kentucky, running through the woods in the dead of night while the master's family was distracted by a holiday party. She had walked for 3 days, hiding in hollow logs and under piles of leaves. Her milk was drying up from fear and exhaustion, and the baby, Samuel, was listless and quiet, too quiet. When she saw Grace's light flickering through the trees, she nearly collapsed. It was a tiny yellow star in a vast blackness. She stumbled to the door, her bare feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. Grace opened the door. The gust of cold air made the lantern flame dance. She saw the young mother, her face gaunt and wild, and the baby, whose small chest was barely moving. Grace didn't hesitate. She pulled them inside, locked the door, and wrapped them both in a quilt. She warmed milk in a pan, spooned it into little Samuel's mouth, and watched as his tiny lips began to move, sucking weakly. A great shudder went through Margaret, and she began to weep, silent, heaving sobs that had been locked inside her for days. Grace simply held her. "You are safe here," she murmured, over and over. "No one will find you here." She hid them in the cellar, which she had improved over the years. A straw mattress, woolen blankets, a jug of water, a chamber pot, and a small crate with biscuits and dried apples. The trapdoor was under the kitchen rug, disguised so well that once, a visiting sheriff had stood right on top of it and never noticed a thing. Margaret and the baby stayed for 4 days while a blizzard raged outside, piling snow against the door. Grace sat with them, told them the names of the stars that could guide them when the clouds parted, and described the next station, a grist mill run by a sympathetic family. When the storm broke and the world was a silent, frozen white, Grace gave Margaret a pair of her own wool stockings, a heavy shawl, and a coat. That coat, my darling, was one of the coats that had passed through Fisher's tailor shop. Inside its lining were Eli's tiny thread maps. Grace had received it from a conductor who said a strange boy in Cincinnati had stitched it. Margaret traced the raised embroidery with her fingers and wept again. This time at the astonishing kindness of strangers, Margaret made it to Canada. Her son Samuel grew up to be a carpenter, a man with strong hands and a quiet smile, who built houses in a free black community and always kept a lantern burning on his own porch, in memory of the widow who saved him. Grace's lantern never went out. Even during the war, when the need for the railroad lessened, she kept it lit. Soldiers passing by would see it and know they could knock for a hot meal or a place to sleep. She became a legend, the Lamplight Widow. And when she died, an old woman with nothing to her name but a small farm and a large heart, the entire community came to her funeral, black and white, Quaker and Baptist, farmers and storekeepers. They buried her next to her husband and daughter, under the oak tree, and someone placed a small oil lamp on her grave, its flame burning through the night. These small acts, my love, are the bricks that build a bridge across history. Eli's stitches, Grace's lamp, Margaret's courage. None of them made a grand speech or led an army, but they bent the arc of the world just a little, and a little more, and a little more. They remind us that heroism is often quiet, constant, and nearly invisible. Like the heart beating in the chest while the world sleeps, now the war comes roaring back into our story. For 4 years, the United States tore itself apart. The battles had lyrical names: Bull Run, Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, but they were scenes of indescribable carnage. The weapons were new and deadly. Rifled muskets that could hit a target from hundreds of yards, devastating artillery shells, ironclad ships. Medical care was primitive. Infection killed more than bullets. Field hospitals were nightmares. The technology of death had outpaced the technology of healing. Soldiers wrote letters home, scribbled in pencil by campfires, full of longing and dread. I think of you constantly, they wrote, and I dream of the quiet fields where we walked. Lincoln, in the White House, bore the weight of every casualty. He was not a military man. He taught himself strategy by reading books borrowed from the Library of Congress. He went through a succession of generals: McClellan, too timid; Burnside, disastrous at Fredericksburg; Hooker, overconfident; Meade, slow to pursue, until he found Ulysses S. Grant, a rumpled, cigar-smoking man from Ohio with a reputation for drinking and a talent for relentless total war. Grant understood that to win, the Union had to destroy the Confederacy's ability to fight, and that meant targeting not just armies but the economic infrastructure that supported them, including slavery. Grant also understood something deeper. The war was fundamentally a crusade for human freedom, and he treated the enslaved people who flocked to Union lines as allies, not encumbrances. The enlistment of black soldiers, authorized after the Emancipation Proclamation, transformed the conflict. Nearly 200,000 black men served in the Union Army and Navy. They fought with extraordinary bravery, often under the shadow of a Confederate proclamation saying that any black man captured in uniform would be executed or sold into slavery. One regiment, the 54th Massachusetts, composed of free northern black men and some escaped slaves, became legendary. Their commander was a young, idealistic white officer named Robert Gould Shaw, from a prominent abolitionist family. They led a desperate assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, charging across a narrow strip of sand into a storm of bullets. They reached the parapet before being driven back with terrible losses. Shaw was killed, his body thrown into a mass grave with his men, an intended insult that became instead a badge of honor. Their courage was reported in newspapers across the North and helped to shatter the myth that black men would not fight. A memorial poem captured the sentiment. From the reeking plain of battle, the unslumbering can host bore him up against black hands, and placed him in their midst. Now, Let me take you into a quieter, more personal moment, our third story inside the story. Let me tell you about a Union Army nurse named Clara. Clara was a free black woman from Philadelphia, in her late 20s, with a calm, resolute face and hands that never seemed to tremble. When the war broke out, she felt a profound calling to serve, but the Army Nursing Corps was initially closed to black women. So she volunteered anyway, traveling to Washington and then to the field hospitals in Virginia, offering her services wherever they would be accepted. She cooked broth, washed linens, wrote letters for dying men, and held hands in the dark. She saw horrors that would have broken a lesser spirit: gangrene, amputations without proper anesthesia, boys crying for their mothers. But she also saw moments of stunning grace. One night, in a makeshift hospital set up in a requisition church, Clara was making her rounds with a small candle. The pews had been replaced by cots, and the walls echoed with groans. In a corner cot lay a very young Confederate soldier, a boy of perhaps 16, with a shattered leg and a face as pale as the pillow. He had been captured during a skirmish and brought here because the surgeons were too overwhelmed for finer distinctions. He was delirious, muttering about home, about a creek where he used to fish, about his mother's peach cobbler. Clara sat beside him, wiped his forehead with a cool cloth, and held his hand. He opened his eyes briefly, saw her face, a black woman's face, and something flickered in his gaze, the ingrained prejudice of his upbringing. But the delirium and the kindness overwhelmed it. "Are you an angel?" he whispered. Clara smiled softly. "No, child. I'm just a nurse. Rest now." She stayed with him until he died, in the early morning, his hand clutched in hers. Afterward, she wrote a letter to his family, telling them that their son had not been alone, that someone had been with him, praying. She didn't sign her full name, she simply signed it "a friend." Clara's story reminds us that compassion does not ask for papers. It does not care which uniform you wear. It sees only the suffering and the soul. She served throughout the war, and when it ended, she worked in the Freedmen's Bureau schools, teaching children just like Samuel. She never sought recognition, but her life was a quiet, steady testament to the truth that love can bridge the deepest chasms. Now we must return to the center of the storm, to Abraham Lincoln, who in the autumn of 1863 was invited to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a national cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The battle there, in July, had been the war's turning point. 3 days of unimaginable bloodshed, culminating in Pickett's charge, a doomed Confederate assault. Across open fields, more than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The small town of Gettysburg was left to bury the dead, and the stench of corpses lingered for weeks. Lincoln arrived by train, his face gaunt with exhaustion and the early symptoms of what may have been a mild case of smallpox. The main oration was delivered by Edward Everett, a renowned speaker who spoke for over 2 hours, his voice rolling over the crowd like an organ. Then Lincoln rose, a piece of paper in his hand, and spoke for just over 2 minutes. His voice was high and clear, carrying easily in the crisp November air. The speech was so brief that the photographer missed his shot. But those words, "my darling," they have never stopped echoing. He began. "For 67 years ago our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That simple, majestic opening redefined the war. It was not just a struggle to preserve the Union. It was a test of whether any nation dedicated to such a proposition could long endure. He spoke of the brave men who had consecrated the ground far beyond anything the living could add. Then he turned the purpose of the war outward, toward the future. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. A new birth of freedom. That phrase, my love, is the hinge of our story. Lincoln was no longer merely fighting to restore the old Union. He was fighting to bring forth a transformed nation, one in which the shackles of slavery were not just loosened but smashed, and in which the promise of the Declaration of Independence was made real for everyone. The war ground on. General Grant slogged through the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Terrible battles of attrition that cost the Union tens of thousands of men but pushed Lee's army inexorably toward Richmond. In Georgia, General William Tecumseh Sherman cut a swath of destruction, his march to the sea laying waste to the Confederate heartland and freeing thousands of slaves who followed his columns in a great, exuberant, chaotic migration. Sherman, a complicated man who was often brutal and dismissive, nevertheless issued Special Field Order No. 15, promising 40 acres and a mule to freed families along the coast, a promise that was later largely broken, a seed of future injustice that would take generations to address. But for those few months, the vision of black families working their own land became a glorious, defiant possibility that in April 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond fell. Lincoln himself visited the city, just days after its evacuation. He walked through the streets, a tall figure in a black stovepipe hat, surrounded by a jubilant crowd of black residents who had recently been enslaved. Men and women wept and knelt, calling him Father Abraham, their Moses. Lincoln, deeply moved, simply said to one old man who knelt before him, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy." It was a moment of profound, aching beauty, the culmination of so much suffering and hope. Lincoln saw the burned-out buildings, the shelled-out ruins, and he felt the immense weight of what came next: rebuilding, reconciliation, securing the rights of the newly freed. The war officially ended at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, when Lee surrendered to Grant in a dignified, Samba ceremony. Grant, magnanimous in victory, allowed the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses and sidearms for the spring plowing. He ordered that no celebration be made, no parading of prisoners. The war was over. The Union was preserved. Slavery was finished. The lilacs bloomed early that April in Washington, and the city was delirious with joy. Then, on the night of April 14th, Good Friday, just 5 days later, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to see a comedy called Our American Cousin. He sat in a box decorated with flags. At about 10 o'clock, an actor named John Wilkes Booth, a bitter Confederate sympathizer, crept into the box and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, too tall for the bed, laid diagonally across it. There, surrounded by his cabinet, his wife, and the heavy, silent vigil of a shattered nation, he died in the small hours of the morning. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, a gruff, unsentimental man, stood by the bed and murmured the words that have become immortal. Now he belongs to the ages. The nation plunged into a grief so vast it seemed to swallow the joy of victory. A long funeral train carried Lincoln's body from Washington to Springfield, retracing the route he had taken as president-elect, stopping in cities where hundreds of thousands of mourners lined the tracks, weeping. Black and white, rich and poor, they stood in the rain and the darkness to pay tribute to the man who had carried their burdens on his stooped shoulders. Lucy, by now a young woman living in a contraband camp near Memphis, heard the news and sat down on the ground, bewildered. "Who will take care of us now?" she whispered. It was a question that echoed across the South, and it would prove painfully prophetic. But even as she wept, she remembered her mother's song, and she began to hum it, softly, to herself. Before his death, Lincoln had pushed through Congress the mechanism that would make emancipation permanent and irreversible, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It had passed the Senate easily but faced a bitter fight in the House of Representatives. The story of how it passed in January 1865 is a drama in itself, a mix of moral fervor, political arm-twisting, and backroom deals, all orchestrated by a man determined to make the promise of the proclamation unbreakable. The final vote was a knife edge. When the tally reached the necessary two-thirds, the House erupted in pandemonium. Cheers, tears, hats thrown in the air, men embracing. Black spectators in the gallery sang the battle hymn of the Republic. Outside, cannons roared a salute, and so the amendment became law, etched into the nation's foundational document. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. In that single sentence, the chains that had held millions were broken at the deepest legal root. No longer a peculiar institution, no longer a matter of state law. Slavery was forever banished. The 13th Amendment was the great stake driven through the heart of the beast. Now, my drowsy one, let me take a moment here to show you how the ripples of this great change spread outward. Let me tell you our fourth small story, the story of a teacher named Miss Clara, a different Clara, but carrying the same light. This Clara was a young black woman from Massachusetts, educated at an abolitionist school, who in 1867 traveled to a remote part of South Carolina under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau. She went to a town called Middleton, a place of live oaks draped in Spanish moss and dusty red roads. There, in a one-room building that had once been a Confederate storehouse, she set up a school. Her students ranged from tiny children to elderly men and women, all of whom had been denied literacy under slavery. The walls were rough-hewn, the benches splintery, the textbooks a motley collection of donated primers and old spelling books. But every morning, the room filled to bursting. The students sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces intense with concentration. One of her students was an old woman named Aunt Easter, who was nearly 80 years old. Easter had been born on a rice plantation, had survived the Middle Passage in her grandmother's stories, and had raised 15 children, most of them sold away. She came to school leaning on a carved walking stick, her eyes cloudy with cataracts, but her determination was fierce. "I want to read the Bible before I die," she told Miss Clara. "I want to read the words of Jesus with my own eyes." 4 months, she struggled. Her knotted fingers could barely hold the slate pencil. The letters danced and blurred. But every day she came, rain or shine. And one afternoon, she slowly, painfully, sounded out the first verse of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Tears streamed down her wrinkled face. She had uncorked a wellspring of meaning that had been sealed her whole life. The room went silent, then erupted in applause. Another student was a shy boy of about 10 named Jonah. Jonah was quick, fiercely intelligent, but he carried a deep anger. He had seen his father dragged off by a patroller when he was 5, never to return. He had learned to survive by making himself invisible. But in Miss Clara's classroom, he bloomed. He devoured books. He learned arithmetic so fast that he was soon helping Miss Clara teach the younger students. He discovered a passion for poetry, memorizing long passages from a tattered edition of Shakespeare that someone had donated. Years later, Jonah would become a teacher himself, then a lawyer, and finally, in the early 20th century, a state legislator during the fleeting biracial democracy of Reconstruction. His voice, when he spoke on the floor of the State House, was deep and measured, and he always quoted a line from The Tempest, "Oh, brave new world, that has such people in't." That wave of educational fervor swept across the South after the war. Hundreds of schools, like Miss Clara's, sprang up, supported by Northern missionary societies, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the insatiable hunger of the formerly enslaved to learn. Black literacy rates rose from near zero to around 50% within a few decades. These schools were the seeds of institutions that still stand today. Morehouse College, Howard University, Fisk University, Hampton Institute. Education became the cornerstone of the freedom struggle, a way to claim full humanity in a society that had for centuries denied it. Reconstruction, my darling, was that brief, tumultuous, hopeful period after the war when the country tried to remake itself. The 14th and 15th Amendments were passed, promising equal protection under the law and voting rights regardless of race. Black men voted in massive numbers, sending their representatives to Congress. 2 black senators and over a dozen black representatives served in that era, a descendant of slaves rising to speak in the very capital that Lincoln had hallowed. Black sheriffs, black mayors, black school boards. For a few shining years, democracy flowered in the South. But the roots of white supremacy ran deep and bitter. Terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan arose, burning schools, lynching teachers, intimidating voters. The federal government, exhausted by war and distracted by other priorities, gradually withdrew its protection. By 1877, Reconstruction was effectively over. The South descended into the long night of Jim Crow segregation, a system of enforced inequality that would last for nearly a century. It is important, my dear, to understand that the abolition of slavery did not immediately bring the full sweetness of freedom. Freedom is not an event. It is a process. Lucy, who we first met in a cotton field, lived to see emancipation, but she also lived to see her sons denied the vote, her daughters forced into domestic service for the same families that had once owned them. She saw the sharecropping system trap black families in debt, a new kind of bondage by another name. She weathered the storm of disappointment with a quiet, unbreakable dignity, the same song in her heart. She would sit on her porch in the evening, looking at the sunset, and tell her grandchildren, "We have come a mighty long way, and the road ahead is long too. But don't you ever stop walking. Don't you ever stop singing." Her granddaughter, a bright girl named Ida, would grow up to become a journalist, a crusader against lynching, her pen a sword of fire. Ida B. Wells was her name, and she embodied the truth that the struggle continues, generation after generation, drawing strength from those who came before. Now, my love, let's leap across the decades to a hot August day in 1963. The Lincoln Memorial Steps, that white marble temple on the National Mall. 250,000 people have gathered, a sea of faces stretching to the Washington Monument. They carry signs saying jobs and freedom. The air is thick with heat and hope, and a man with a calm, noble face, a Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King Jr., steps to the podium. He looks out at the crowd, and he begins to speak. He speaks of Lincoln, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today. He speaks of the check that has come back marked insufficient funds, the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution that still, 100 years after emancipation, had not been honored for Black Americans. Then he moves beyond the prepared text, pushed by the urging of the great gospel. Singer Mahalia Jackson, who cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." And he tells them. "I have a dream," he says, his voice rising into a prophetic cadence, "that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood." He dreams that his 4 little children will be judged not by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. He dreams of freedom ringing from every mountainside, from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire to the mighty mountains of New York, from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania to the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, from Stone Mountain of Georgia to Lookout Mountain of Tennessee, and every hill and molehill of Mississippi. "Let freedom ring," he intones, until the words become a great bell pealing across the land. And when he finishes, "Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!" The crowd roars, a sound like the ocean itself rising up. That dream, my darling, did not spring from nowhere. It was the direct descendant of Lincoln's new birth of freedom. It was the flowering of the seed planted by Eli's threaded maps, Grace's lantern, Margaret's desperate river crossing, Samuel's first halting letter F. It was the continuation of a story that began in the hulls of slave ships and the hush of the cotton fields. And it is still being written, because freedom is not a statue that sits in a museum, polished and unchanging. Freedom is a garden. It must be watered, weeded, and tended by every generation. There are always new weeds, prejudice, indifference, the temptation to look away from suffering because it is not our own. But there are also always gardeners, people who stand up, speak out, reach across divides, and do the small, holy work of repair. That work is not finished, and it never will be. It is the work of being human together, and that brings me, my precious one, to you. Here you are, in your soft bed, in a time very distant from the cotton rows and the battlefields. You have rights that Lucy could barely imagine. You can learn anything, go anywhere, love anyone, speak your mind, and be treated fairly under the law. But those rights did not fall from the sky like rain. They were won, fiercely and imperfectly, by millions of people who refuse to give up. And they are safeguarded only by the conscience and courage of ordinary people who decide, every day, that freedom matters. What does that mean for you? It means that you, too, carry a light. When you see someone being teased or excluded, and you stand beside them, you are tending the garden. When you listen to a story that is different from your own, and you try to understand, you are watering the freedom tree. When you use your voice for kindness, for truth, for the little ones who cannot yet speak for themselves, you are part of the great river of justice that has flowed through history, from the old Hebrew prophets to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King to the child sitting here tonight, drowsy and full of dreams. You have power, my darling. Real power. It might not feel like it when you are small and the world is so large. But the most powerful things often start small. A stitch, a lamp, a hum, a word, a decision to be kind when it would be easier to be cruel. These are the seeds of transformation. History is not just made by presidents and generals. It is made by people like you, in the quiet moments of choosing what is right. So hold that knowledge close. Hold the memory of Lucy, who kept singing when she had no words. Hold the image of Eli, stitching hope into a coat lining. Hold the courage of Margaret, crossing the freezing river. Hold the steadfastness of Grace, lighting her lantern every night. Hold the dignity of Lincoln, who carried the nation's sorrow on his bent shoulders and gave his life for the new birth of freedom. Hold the joy of Samuel, reading his first word. Hold the dream of Martin, ringing out from marble steps. They are all part of you now. They are your invisible family. They whisper to you across the years, saying, "You are free. Use it well. Use it kindly. Use it to make the world a little more just, a little more loving, a little more whole." And now, my love, the night has grown very deep. The moon, our faithful lantern, has climbed to the very peak of the sky. It spills its cool silver light through the window, painting a long rectangle on the floor. The trees outside rustle gently, swaying in a breeze that smells of night-blooming jasmine and distant rain. The house is silent. The whole world seems to be breathing slowly, in and out, in and out, a great sleeping animal at peace. You have traveled far tonight, my brave one. Across cotton fields and frozen rivers, through candlelit rooms and secret cellars, onto battlefields and marble steps. You have met children and elders, despair and triumph. And you have returned, safely, to this warm, sacred space. Let the story settle in your heart like a seed in good soil. It will grow there, in its own time, and it will make you strong in ways you may not see for years, but for now, let it rest. Let yourself rest. Feel the soft pillow cradle your head. Feel the weight of the blanket, a gentle anchor keeping you moored. Listen to the quiet rhythm of your own breath. It is the same rhythm that beat in the hearts of all those brave souls who came before. The same rhythm that will beat in the hearts of those yet to come. You are a link in a golden chain, a chain of freedom and compassion and stubborn hope. You are loved beyond measure. You are free, and that freedom is a sacred trust. But tonight, all you need to do is sleep. The work of the world can wait until morning. The garden will be there, ready for your tending. The lantern will still be burning. So close your eyes, my darling. Let your body go limp and heavy. Let go of the day's worries, the little anxieties that nibble at your mind. They will be there tomorrow, but they will seem smaller after a night of deep rest. Just breathe. Sleep is a kind of freedom too, a daily forgetting, a daily renewal. It is the soul's way of resting in the arms of a loving universe. Good night, my precious one. Dream of wide green hills under a boundless sky. Dream of a tall man in a stovepipe hat, tipping his hat to a little girl who is laughing as she runs through a field. No chains on her ankles, no weight on her heart. Dream of a river shining in the moonlight, carrying boats filled with singing people. Dream that you are in a meadow, and everyone you have ever loved is there, those you know, and those whose names you only learn tonight. The air is made of music, and the light is golden, and everything, at last, is well. Sleep deeply. Rise strong. You are part of the dream that does not die.